There's historical reasons why the U.S. government, just taking U.S. as an example, and its corporate sponsors are unresponsive to the will of the people and act in such a way as to protect the wealthiest few at the expense of the many and the expense of the environment. In 1781, the former colonies, which were now states, ratified the Articles of Confederation, which would have reserved most of the power of government for the states and had a decentralized government in large part. But then when delegates from the state legislatures met again just 6 years later at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 held in Philadelphia, suddenly the meetings held secretly. The notes aren't released for about another 53 years, and the participants were pledged to secrecy. It was behind closed doors. And between 1781 and 1787, there were a number of events which led to the way the meeting went. There were conflicts between classes that were played out with the state legislatures, and there were conflicts between classes that had given rise to armed insurrections against state governments. And the men who assembled for the Constitutional Convention were all men of property. And James Madison, for instance, the Constitution's primary author, told the convention that the greatest conflict that the country faced was the conflict between those who held property and those who didn't. The Constitution was basically designed to protect the interests of the propertied few. And in part, by removing power from the state legislatures, which had been attacking the propertied classes, and also protecting and ensuring the continuance of certain types of economic enterprise which were favorable to the propertied class, and also by holding the Union together. It's important to recognize that at that time of the American Revolution, most people in the colonies were not considered citizens. Native Americans, in fact, were not even considered people. African Americans were considered property. Women were considered property. Debtors were considered property, even children. So while human rights were not protected in the main body of the Constitution, the obligation to return runaway slaves to the slave owners was specified in the Constitution. Only about 20% of the colonists were enfranchised citizens, and of those, the wealthiest were the ones who framed the government to protect their class interests through the Constitution. And throughout the history of the U.S., whole classes of people have had to struggle separately for their basic civil rights. There's been the African American civil rights struggle, women's suffrage movement, and these struggles continue to today, including struggles for gays and lesbians to have recognized rights and so forth. The fatal flaw in the revolution, at which time all men were declared to be equal, was that there were gross inequities, and that helps explain why different activists in the U.S. have evolved with all their different issues. They're all divided by race, class, gender, and issue, all operating separately. And this has made it really easy for the corporate powers to divide and conquer us. And they tend to do this through the use of scapegoats. You see in the news, welfare mothers, they're to blame for your ills, the communists hiding under the beds, the gays and lesbians, the environmentalists, the spotted owls, anybody but the real corporate perpetrators of the policies. And when looking at corporate abuses and corporate domination of our culture and government, it's important to recognize that corporations have not always wielded these powers. At the time of the revolution, the revolutionists were very concerned about corporate power because of their experience with the British Crown corporations as they saw it oppressing them and preventing them from creating finished products to trade at higher value. Instead, they were required to ship raw materials to England for them to create the finished products. So there were strict limitations set upon corporations with the beginning of the new country, such as a corporation could not buy out another corporation and amass greater wealth and power. It was not allowed to lobby public officials to influence public policy. It had a certain time frame in which to exist, 5, 10, or 20 years. Basically, for instance, a paper-making corporation could only make paper. It couldn't lobby public officials. It couldn't give charitable donations to improve its public image. None of that. And even though only about 20% of the public were enfranchised citizens, those citizens did have the right to go before the state legislature and say, we believe that this corporation has exceeded its given authority given to it by the public as an instrument of the public will, and the burden of proof was on the corporation, not the individual citizen, to prove that it shouldn't be dissolved. And indeed, corporate charters were revoked and their assets were distributed, especially in the case of mergers. So anyway, this started to change, because with the coming of the Civil War in particular, there was a tremendous influx of money into the economy, which wars tend to do. They started running the railroads across the country to facilitate troop movements. That created a great railroad industry. They wanted a centralized banking system, the Union did, so that the troops could spend money anywhere in the country. At that time, banking was pretty decentralized. You had to be roughly within 50 miles of the bank for your banknote to be recognized. So they created the Federal Reserve System soon thereafter and the centralized banking system. And this all put a lot of money into the corporate system, creating new corporations like grain, insurance, all this kind of thing, and also expanding the power through the banking system for the existing corporate operations. And so the corporate CEOs looked at this situation and suddenly started having grand dreams. Look at how much money we could raise. And they saw that they were limited by these charter limitations, by these restrictions placed on corporations, and by the quo warranto, literally by what authority challenges that citizens could make to their operations. So they gradually started winning for corporations the constitutional rights of citizens behind closed doors through judge-made law, and such as freedom of speech, due process, and so forth, using the Bill of Rights and the 14th Amendment. And along the way, they were conceded corporate personhood. In 1886, Santa Clara decision creating the strange concept of a corporate citizen being able to have these rights. So with corporations now setting public policy, paying for politicians, and ensuring political agendas they want are met, it's important to remember that corporations were originally devised simply as tools to serve the public welfare. And now that they've developed institutions to advance their collective agenda, like lobbying organizations, PACs, think tanks, public relations firms, and the armies and the military and police to serve them, it's really important to recognize it's an entire system of corporate governance we're talking about. So it's not enough for activists anymore to go against one corporation at a time or one abuse at a time. We need to start dismantling the system of corporate power. And that way we can get back to the point where people define once again what corporations can and can't do rather than letting corporations define us.